mastery, a great sign of mastery is the ability to explain complicated things in a simple way so that everybody can understand them. And that's a part of a leader's job, is to look at this field, this space in which your organization is operating, and the complexities of it, and the plan, and where we're going, and the vision, and all these things, and to be able to explain that to everybody in the organization so that everybody in the organization knows clearly what that is. So taking that very complex calculus and boiling it down to here are the things that we're going to do, and also, very importantly, making it so that every person in the organization sees themselves in that plan, in what you're trying to communicate. And that takes effort, and that takes energy. Welcome to The Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. All right, on a previous episode, Justin, we talked a little bit about communication, the final of the 4 C's of leadership. It's hard to imagine being able to influence, that is, lead someone without being able to communicate with them in some form or fashion.
Absolutely. I've through whatever it is, political speeches or post-game interviews, I've seen a lot of speeches lately and really come to the realization of how important communication is for leadership. But it seems like sometimes people in those positions aren't really thinking before they're talking. So I feel like communication needs to be clear and consistent when we talk about leadership. What do you think about that? What do you think about a clear and consistent message when it comes to leadership?
Yeah, I think that's really important. If you're going to lead somebody, they need to know what you're trying to communicate to them. They need to have some idea of what's going on. I think you really hit on an important idea with regard to clarity here. And that came up quite a bit during my interviews with the generals and admirals. In my book, I ended up referring to this idea as get it right in your own mind first. That is, as a leader, you have to take time to think about those things that are really important that you are going to try to communicate. Maybe it's something simple, or maybe it's something that's tremendously complex. Whatever the case, as a leader, you need to understand it and understand where you stand on it. I can say it's incontrovertible. If you don't know what you want to say, no one else will know what you are trying to say. Now, don't get me wrong. People do that all the time these days, saying all sorts of things that must surely represent a lack of time thinking about what they're saying before the words just come rushing out of their mouths or fingers on the keyboard or whatever. But I would say rarely do those situations result in the communication of anything very meaningful.
How much time do you think you need to spend, or do you spend thinking about what you're going to say before you say it? I mean, I know there's a lot of times where, people are doing post-game interviews, or, whether it's some surprise question that they're not prepared for. But when you're talking about leadership, where really you're trying to communicate the things we've talked about before, vision, where you see us going, how much time do you spend thinking about those things before you present them to the people that you're leading?
So I got a couple answers on that. The first is more toward just the leadership, and the second will be just more a little bit insight into me maybe. But the first is, I think that leaders have to spend time thinking. Thinking is a big part of leadership because you need to know what the plan is going to be, where you're trying to head, and then how you're going to communicate that to people in a way that's clear. I think it was Mark Twain or somebody way smarter than me said, sorry, my letter is so long. If I would have had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. And that is the ability to take our thoughts and make them clear and meaningful and concise takes time, and we need to think about that. But then there's the question of how much time do I personally spend thinking about things. I spend a lot of time thinking about things, and part of that is because honestly, I've spent my whole life trying to get rid of my accent. Okay, so when I was growing up, I didn't recognize that I had an accent until we went to Disney World when I was 6, and this woman came over and was like, "Where are you from?" In East Tennessee, right? And she was talking to my mom, because I can tell from the way your son talks. And so it was this sense of being different, and that it was somehow bad to sound like I did. And so I spent so much time, every word that I say, I run through a mental filter. And then the things that I'm going to say, I think ahead of time anyway. And so I actually spend a lot of energy thinking about what I'm going to say before I say it, which probably results in the way I speak in general. Anyway, so that's a little bit more of an insight into me and my thinking on speaking just in general, but certainly apart from my own idiosyncrasies with accent and whatnot, I think that it's imperative that we as leaders spend time thinking about what we're going to say to make sure that we're going to say something worthwhile. When we're giving a presentation or a speech, or if we're just talking to people one-on-one, people are always listening to what we say. They're always listening. They may, we may not recognize that they're listening, but they're always listening. And so if we're going to say something, it needs to be worthwhile. And it needs to not be something flippant or stupid, because all it takes is one misunderstanding, and then suddenly that spreads, and there's a real problem that never should have been if we just thought before we opened our mouth, or didn't open our mouth.
Obviously, we need to be thoughtful in what we're saying, but why is communication so important in leadership? So much so that it made it into just one of the 4 C's. I mean, obviously communication is important in life, but why specifically for leadership is communication so important? How did it make it for one of the 4 C's?
Yeah, well, I think if we go back to our fundamental definition of leadership, influencing others to achieve a common goal. How do you influence someone else? It's through communication of some sort. It may not necessarily be verbal or written. It may be nonverbal in some form or fashion. And so, again, people are watching, people are listening to see what you say or what you do, and that's how you influence them, for good or ill. And so I think that without communication, it's nigh impossible to really influence somebody in a meaningful way, I would say. Now, people might say, well, aren't people on TikTok or something like that influencing others? They are, but it's through some action, it's through some words, it's through something that people can recognize in someone and receive that signal that leads them to be influenced in some way or other. And by all means, I'm not advocating that the folks that are putting out all sorts of things on TikTok are necessarily the people we need to be following. But I'm just using that as an example that even in that situation, there's some form of communication.
Some effective communication that the person's hearing. What do you think when we talk about sort of effective leadership means you are effectively communicating? That requires you to have thought about what you're going to say and really have it in your own mind. It sort of goes back to the medical thing of see one, do one, teach one. Like you've got to know what you're doing before you actually teach it. So same thing with communication. But what do you think are the things that get in the way of people thinking about what they're going to say Is it just laziness in communication? Like where are the barriers for leaders today?
I think there are a host of things, probably that,
Can of worms.
yeah, exactly. A host of things that negatively impact people's communication. I think first is that they don't take the time, or it's not a practice that they've been used to, or even perhaps people get promoted into or given some leadership position or platform, and to that point in their careers or life or whatever, they haven't necessarily had to reflect on what they're going to say and the degree of impact that it might have. I mean, if we look at this podcast, Science Leadership here, our hope is that there are people all over the world who are listening to this at some point in the near term. And so everything that we say should have meaning. It should have value to those people who are listening. And the same thing is the case for leaders, that once you're in a position of leadership, you should be considering that the audience may be much larger than you think, and they're listening when you may not recognize it. And so I think a lot of people aren't in the habit of thinking about what they say. And so they say something flippantly, but then that gets taken by somebody and it can destroy so much. There's so many stories of people who were in a position of leadership or authority, and they said something as Tom, okay? I'm just Tom, I'm just talking, we're just whatever. And it was taken out of a context or whatever that may be, and that dissolved all of their credibility, their leadership influence, and so forth. And I think in those situations is because they're not recognizing that you are always the leader. That's not, you can't just flip a switch and be like, okay, right now I'm just Tom. And then flip the switch back and now I'm leader man or whatever. And I think that most people don't think about that. And I can say that that's something I've had to wrestle with, because I like to joke. I like to make, silly comments about nonsense sometimes or whatever. But I have to recognize that, I can't do that so much. And I think that's why a lot of leaders in high positions say that leadership can be lonely. Because you have to some degree mitigate just your kind of natural personality sometimes, because you are regulating, what am I saying, what am I doing, and there's the spontaneity isn't there as much, I think. And so I think that's a thing, is just the not having been used to it. And the fact that sometimes messages are really hard to deliver, because it's hard to articulate what it is that you're trying to say, what's really important, and to say it in a way that's understandable and approachable. For us as physicians, we know plenty of physicians who cannot speak anything other than medicalese. You got a family here who has limited education or understanding, and they're speaking about all sorts of scientific garble, right? And using abbreviations of sorts and things as if these folks know. And then the family leaves knowing less than they did when they got there.
Might as well be speaking a foreign language.
Right, because it is in a real sense. And so mastery, a great sign of mastery, is the ability to explain complicated things in a simple way so that everybody can understand them. And that's a part of a leader's job, is to look at this field, this space in which your organization is operating, and the complexities of it, and the plan, and where we're going, and the vision, and all these things, and to be able to explain that to everybody in the organization so that everybody in the organization knows clearly what that is. So taking that very complex calculus and boiling it down to, here are the things that we're going to do, and also, very importantly, making it so that every person in the organization sees themselves in that plan, in what you're trying to communicate. And that takes effort, and that takes energy, and that takes thinking about what you're going to say before you just open your mouth and stuff comes out.
That's a great point. I was talking to somebody last week about mission statements, and we pulled up one from a company that we were involved in, and it was like 2 pages long. And I, scarce to say, no one in the company actually knew what it was or could recite it. And I had read something previously that's like, a mission statement, everyone should know what it is, and everyone should be able to freely recite it, of like, from the person at the bottom of the flow chart to the top, they should know what your mission is. It should be, just as you talked about, effectively communicated to everyone so that they know where they're going. They know, this is my part in this big process. This is where we're going. For me personally, as you were talking, I was thinking about the barriers of communication. I always think about how I communicate to my children. One of the things that always gets in the way of me is emotion, either emotion or pride. One of those two. Like, they say something, they do something, and I need to, in that moment, effectively communicate what my expectations of them are. But a lot of times, I don't think about what I really need to say, how I really need to see it from their side, like we talked about before, seeing it from what your people really need. And you need to hear what I need to say. And so it's this really ineffective communication. How many times,
if it's communication at all?
Yeah. Or just chastising criticism. How many times do you think emotion or pride gets in the way of effective communication with leaders outside of family, but like leadership positions and jobs or careers or things like that?
I don't know. I would say the thing that came to mind when you were asking that was, how many times doesn't it?
It's probably a smaller number.
Yeah. I mean, I think that especially the pride thing, I think there are a lot of folks in leadership positions who do have that kind of authoritarian, this is the way it's going to be, I'm going to tell you the answer, and that sort of thing. And broadcasting is what I kind of describe it as in the book. And when I think about it, again, we talked about Icelandic and JFK, in a previous episode, but you can be broadcasting and not communicating. And so I think, and pride certainly can be a player in that. And emotion, oh my goodness. There's the communication of stage fright and public speaking, or the emotion of stage fright with regard to public speaking and all that goes with that, fear and anxiety and all those things, that can disrupt your communication. There's agitation or anger. There's sadness, dismay, depression, so many different emotions that can impact in a negative way how we communicate. And so I think both of those, emotion and pride, can easily get in the way of communication. Easily.
I mean, yeah, I don't think anybody listening to this will have any problem sort of understanding that communication is so important, because even if you understand it and you know where you're going, and you've got a good vision, and like we've talked about in previous episodes, the people you're leading trust you, and If you can't effectively communicate the destination or your expectations or any of that, then none of it matters. You might as well be speaking a foreign language.
Right.
What does the science say about communication in it relates to leadership? Is it you just need to be effective? It matters how you say it. It matters who's it coming from, trust. Like, what does the science
Yeah.
behind leadership say about communication?
Well, I think, especially with regards to our focus today on getting it right in your own mind, there's actually been a number of things that folks have identified with regard to benefits from getting it right in your own mind, as far as how it affects communication, your ability to lead. Other than the fact that it helps us to get our thoughts together, studies have shown that thinking before we communicate has multiple effects. One of the big ones is cognitive load, and so it affects our cognitive load. And what does that mean? Because that's a little medicalese almost, but that's simply the amount of work our brains have to do at a particular moment, right? So right now I've got cognitive load because I'm trying to say something that's meaningful. I'm trying to interact with you, and I'm thinking about our neighbors have invited us to a party and all these sorts of different things, right? That flood your mind and take up mental space as you're trying to operate. If you think of a computer that's trying to run multiple operations at one time, the more that you have on it, the slower it works and it gets gummed up. And so if we think of things ahead of time and we know what we need to say and we know what the big picture is, then when it comes time to say that thing, we don't have to use a lot of energy to do it. And so if that's the case, that actually affects our decision-making processes too. That includes verbal responses. If we spend time thinking beforehand, again, we decrease the load that our brain has to do in any given moment, and then we can dedicate more energy to clearer, more deliberate communication. Hopefully that is more effective and delivers our message. It also allows us to be better able to control our thinking and manage our impulses. So we talked a bit, you brought up this idea that emotion and pride can affect our communication, right? And so the emotion really gets an impulse sometimes, especially if it's anger or surprise or other things. And those can derail us with regard to our communication. But studies have shown, again, if you think about it beforehand and you know what your message is going to be, then even if you get surprised, this is what I need to say. This is the message I need to deliver. And so you're going to be more effective when you communicate. I mean, again, think about how poorly somebody communicates when they're angry. You don't, like you were saying with your kids, right? Like, you're not communicating your message. All you're communicating is, I'm mad,
Yeah.
right? I mean, or again, overcome with grief. I remember I've had the honor, I guess, to eulogize people, at funerals. My grandmother, my dad, my first cousin, a couple of patients. And were it not for having thought about exactly what I wanted to say, having written that out and practically memorized the eulogy, there'd be no way that I could have done that under those circumstances. And so when you're overcome with grief, then obviously that impacts your communication. But I was able to do it because I had thought of it ahead of time, knew exactly what I wanted to say. And so when we thought of it that way, we don't get hit as hard with those impulses and get derailed. So the same can occur when impulses strike when we're trying to communicate as leaders, not just at a eulogy or so forth. If we have things straight in our minds, we're more likely to be able to self-regulate those impulses and actually get the communication across. So those are the big picture items with regard to the science behind it. Mindfulness and emotional intelligence and control of our cognitive load and burden. So,
It,
but
it's really interesting what you pointed out. I've never thought about this communication, but it's really sort of a story I sort of keep going back to. In anesthesia, you have to take oral boards. So you get examined by senior attendings. You're usually just completed residency, and you have to do it to be an attending. And there's sort of two schools of thought. Like people are like, well, you don't want to have practiced so much that you sound like a tape recorder, like that you're just a robot coming back. They're like, I'm just going to sort of shoot from the cuff and I know the knowledge. And I was like, have you ever heard somebody speak about a subject that they really know well? They sound practiced. They sound polished. They sound
Right.
like a tape recorder because it's literally something they could say in their sleep if they wanted to.
Yeah.
I was like, that's what you want. And I really hear you saying that, like, when it comes to leadership, when you're communicating, you should sound like a tape recorder. It should be a clear, consistent message that you've gotten worked out so much in your mind that it's as if somebody's reading it in a book or reading it off a screen.
Yeah, I mean,
That's when I think about my own mind.
yeah, I think that's a great example. I think as you were saying that, it made me think of a sports team that is really, really practiced so that everybody knows exactly where they're supposed to be, exactly what they're supposed to be doing, especially in basketball. When everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing, where they're supposed to be, they can actually improvise because they know the whole situation, where everybody's supposed to be doing, supposed to be, and what they're supposed to be doing. And so in that moment, they can improvise so that it looks like it's all made up on the fly, but in fact, it's not. It's working within the system. And I think, as you're saying, when we really know a given material, it seems like we've memorized it or something, but when you master something, you're beyond that. You go beyond it so that then it really is striking as you're improvising. It's jazz because you know it so well and you know what everything's interacting. So I would say that I think you're right on with that. I think your anesthesia example is a great one. I was wondering a sort of a similar question that I had in my mind for you is if you had an example of a time when you had really planned out exactly what you wanted to communicate and it worked out really well despite circumstances.
Let me springboard off what you said first for a second because it just popped up in my mind and it's so clear. So at the beginning of this college football season, it's the first year where the coaches have had the ability to have a mic that goes directly to the quarterback's helmet. And one of the top teams in the country was playing this weekend, and they had interviewed the coach and said, how are you going to use this? Because basically it allows the coach to communicate directly to the quarterback up until 15 seconds left on the play clock. And they're like, actually, I don't think we're going to use it that much. And they're like, well, wait, what? Why would you not use that? He goes, because our quarterback knows our system so well, adding more information to him will only hinder his ability to actually do his job.
Right.
And I thought about that. I was like, that's someone who previously has had really effective communication and knows the system. And it's not like he came up with the system himself, but the coaches have communicated that system so well that he can repeat it back to them, and them adding anything with the external pressures only confuses him. It only gives him something he doesn't. Yeah, of course I know that because he already knows everything. For myself, it probably goes back to the anesthesia boards of like a time where it really is a very stressful, like your ability to go practice anesthesia is based on you passing this exam. And it's not like you checking off boxes, like no one's giving you feedback. In fact, they're instructed not to give you feedback because they don't want you to pick up on their body language of whether you're actually getting the right answer or not. So that was a really stressful time, but despite the stress, the anxiety things you talked about giving speeches and that performance anxiety, as soon as they said, what are you going to do with this hypoxia? I already had a tape in my head to play.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my mentors used
Right.
to say, you want to find something where you can play that tape. And I think that's a lot in leadership, where when people ask us questions, we may not know or have heard that exact question, but we know our topic and we know our vision and we know where that question would fit. So it's time to play that tape. I've already thought about it. You're not presenting
Right.
any new information. It may be a little different way to ask it, but I already know. And for me, that's a time where I had already thought about my answers to all of the questions. Maybe not specifically with a 49-year-old OB patient, but I thought about what I was going to do with that particular patient in that situation. And I was ready to effectively communicate that information to them. So that's one for me that had real life impact of like, okay, I need to know my own message to be able to effectively communicate it. Because they didn't know me walking in from Adam. They didn't know anything about me. They didn't know any training I'd done or anything. So my only ability to pass that exam was my ability to effectively communicate what I should have already known. So that's one for me. How about you? Is there an example of like one time where you're like, if I had not really thought about it in my own mind, this would not have gone as well as it actually did?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are tons other than obviously the ones I kind of touched on with regard to eulogizing and so on. There are so many opportunities like that. I can think of a somewhat recent patient family encounter that this has never I was in clinic, and so this was the first time this happened in my career. The person at the front desk came back to our work area to warn us that one of the parents was really agitated. Got in very timely. I mean, but just came in with, didn't like the medical system at all. And I was like, okay, that's super,
Makes my
And
job
so-
easier.
Oh, good. It's my patient. Wonderful. And so anyway, I went into the room with just a couple of key things that I was going to try to do to try to communicate with this family. And having prepared that, having gone through that, it was shocking how well it actually ended up, because I was able to, okay, when we got started, it was just very simple. What are you hoping to get out of the visit today? And approached it from that. And then really just try to interact with this parent in a way that was encouraging. It was clear that this parent had felt disregarded by prior folks in the medical system. And so I really tried to encourage, anytime that the parent said something that was close to accurate with regard to some medical concept, I really try to endorse that, encourage that, and build that up, and so it wasn't necessarily that I in that moment had a spiel, because I got a spiel for a lot of things, because I've been doing this a while, but this was different. This was more of technically, how am I going to approach the conversation, the communication. So I guess, even as I'm saying this, I had not thought about this before this moment, but there is the material. We got to think about the material, and I'll get to this in a little bit, I think, practical points, but then the how are we going to deliver it? And I had not really thought about that with regard to that context before, with that it was a stressful situation that, I mean, it went 180 degrees.
Hmm.
In my career, decades of taking care of kids with really complex, you know, cardiovascular issues, I've never been more amazed. And it was because of just a couple of communication techniques that I had learned shortly there before in a course. So I think that's one that I would say that really
One thing you
impactful.
touched on there, which we've gone a little bit on the other side for this uh, talk, is we've been focusing on understanding it in your own mind before you communicate it. And that's obviously the speaking form of communication. But one thing you keyed on that we've talked a little bit in previous podcasts, specifically the one in caring, that you really need to be able to listen. Speak a little
Yeah.
more about the ability to not only listen, but to hear, and how that is such an important part of communication. We talked about it in previous, like, to really care about somebody, you need to hear them and to listen.
Mhm.
But talk a little more about how, specifically with communication, it is not only communicating to someone, but also receiving that information also.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a lot of people like to say you have two ears and one mouth.
My mom
You should
used
be
to always say
listening at
that.
least twice as much as you talk. And I think that that's that's wise advice for anyone who would be a leader. I, I think that a lot of times in our society, people think that leaders are supposed to just be talking all the time, and we have some folks in leadership positions who do that a lot, and they don't say very much. They talk a whole lot and don't say very much, and they don't listen, and they certainly don't hear. And I think when you when you think back on people who have shown you that they care, and we touched on this previously, part of it is that they conveyed to you some appreciation that you were a meaningful person, that you had value. And there are hardly greater ways to do that than to take the time to be thoughtfully listening
Hmm.
to what someone has to say, and to you said it, to care about the answer.
Hmm.
When we talked before, you said that, and I was struck by that, because that's where it's at. Is this? It's listening, it's hearing, and that can be, that isn't just sound. That's visual cues for those folks who are hearing impaired. It is actually physical, sign. I don't know too many, but that's for them. It, in a very real sense, it is physical, and so it's hearing people, and hearing doesn't just mean the words that they say. Again, it's what's the tone,
Hmm.
what's the cadence, what are the facial expressions, all these things. Taking the time to really listen, and then not necessarily responding immediately, so that it demonstrates that their words have been heard. Instead of spending time trying to figure out what your response is going to be, stop and put that out of your mind. So, I'm trained as an executive coach, and do leadership coaching and so forth. And a huge part of that is just listening,
Hmm.
learning how to listen in a meaningful way, and then follow up on something. When somebody says something, following up on that instead of delivering some answer or some statement, really pulling the thread. Hey, I heard you say this. What did you mean there? Why is that important? What is it about that makes you say that or think that or whatever it may be?
I'm reading a book this week by Simon Sinek, The Leaders Eat Last. And he talks about the circle of safety, how for people to function well in an organization, they need to be in this circle of safety. And not so much talking about physical safety, although that's really important, but this safety where they feel supported and valued. And I'm just struck by the things you've said and how much communication is important to it. How do we do this? Like, obviously, we've talked a lot about the science of it and how important it is, and some examples of it. But practically, how do we do it? If, like you said earlier, like, what are some barriers? Like, people get promoted and they're just not good at communication. Maybe they were really good at getting the communication, hearing it, and acting on it, and now they're promoted into times of leadership. So for those people, or people that are like, listen, I recognize communication isn't my strong suit, I want to be better at it. How do we help them? What are some points they can do this week, today, next month to really work on the fourth C, the communication part of leadership? How do we do that?
Yeah. So in the book and writing on this stuff, I was able to put together some practical sort of concepts for how to do this more effectively, and specifically with regard to leaders. And there are a couple of big points I think that are important when we're thinking about communicating as a leader. A couple of points, and then I'll talk about some other points that are a little bit different. But first is those things that not only really need to be said, but also those things that we as leaders need to be the ones saying. And so sometimes there are things that we just don't, that nobody needs to say. And this gets to the comment I made, or the comments I made pretty early in the episode, where I was saying, as a leader, I have to regulate that. I can't make silly jokes or whatever, because sometimes things don't need to be said. Just let it lie. Leave it alone. Honestly, I think that's an indicator of class. When I think about someone who's classy, is they don't respond to certain stimuli, whereas some of us feel like, I can make a joke out of this, or I can make some comment or whatever. They don't do that. They just let it lie. And so really that first thing is what actually needs to be said. And then the second is, do you need to be the one to say it? Just because you're in a position of leadership and there is some message, it doesn't mean you're the one who needs to say every message or deliver every message. So really thinking through that. What really needs to be said, and are you the one who needs to say it? So that would be the first thing.
Do you have an example of maybe something needs to be said, but you don't need to be the one to say it? Like, can you think of an example? Of like something that obviously the group needs to hear or a person needs to hear, but maybe coming for you, not only that you don't need to say it, but that it'll be less effective if it comes from the leader. Do you have an example of something like that?
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of examples. One example that just pops right to my mind is and this is more about building your bench and training the people that are going to take over for you, right? Is giving those people who came up with the idea the stage to say, here's the idea. Here's what we should be doing. It is common that women get talked over in meetings, or my wife has pointed this out. She's an introvert and she's sharp as a tack, and she will say something in a group or whatever, and people won't hear it. It won't register with them. And then somebody else will pick it up and say the same thing, often a man. And then everybody will act like that man.
That's a great idea. It's a great idea, Charles.
Like, wow, Jim's the smartest guy around. And
I said that. I said,
yeah. And so, and people have studied that, and that happens. And so giving those people the voice, the opportunity, the platform to say those things. I think that's important. Or here's this person I'm developing. I think you should deliver this speech or this message or this talk or this whatever to build them up. You don't always have to be the one in the light, right? So I think those are a couple of examples of things I would say that demonstrate that.
That's a great point. It goes back to sort of some of the things we've talked about before in character, and a leader putting those leaders eat last. You want the people you're leading to succeed much more than your own success. So many examples of that, but that's a great point. I didn't even think about that angle on it.
Yeah. So, then continuing on, think about these practical points that we're talking about here. As we think about those things that we need to communicate, once we've gotten to that place where it's like, this is something that needs to be said. Am I the one to be saying it? Okay, let's say you've gotten to that place potentially. I think there are 4 things that can help us get it right in our mind first. And that's the first thing, what actually needs to be said? What is the fundamental message that you're trying to convey? The second thing is, why does it need to be said? Right? Sometimes our why is inappropriate in the sense that it's out of ego, or, well, I can't think of another inappropriate thing, because most of the time it's out of ego if it doesn't need to be said and we say it.
Sometimes even justice. People just need to know that I'm right, or this is fair.
Yeah.
Any of those things, but you could say, well, that's sort of all ego, isn't it?
Right. You're just trying to prove that you're right. So, yeah. So why does it need to be said? Number 3 is, who is your audience? Because who your audience is really going to change how you shape your message. Again, talking about the scenario where you have some family who has no medical experience, and you're going to speak to them like they're a congenital heart surgeon. Like, that's foolish. Because there are a lot of physicians who wouldn't understand all the lingo that we use in that space, right? And so it's inappropriate. So you got to think of who's your audience and adjust. It's fascinating. When we're dealing with children, we automatically adjust to the audience. But when we're dealing with adults, we don't a lot of times. We have this assumption, and this has been studied also, we attribute to other people that they have a greater amount of knowledge a lot of times, that they know what we know. And so we just speak like we normally speak about the topic, and then it's lost on them. But if it's a child, then we're like, okay, well, here's this 4-year-old. Let's try to communicate on a 4-year-old's level, right?
That's why most medical consents, they say, have to be written at a 5th grade level or something like that, because they have to be able to communicate the risks, benefits to the person's level, whether it be educational level or emotional or whatever it is.
Right. And I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, okay, about people's level of understanding or whatever. I'm trying to say that we need to be able to communicate, and you got to recognize there's certain barriers. And if you're speaking at the level of an expert in a niche field of medicine to somebody who's never heard of a given condition, there's not going to be a lot of communication that takes place. So again, who is the audience, right? That's number 3. Then how should it be said? Which ties in a little bit to what I was just talking about. But how should you say it? Sometimes it's going to be with more directive approach. Other times, maybe softer. It just depends on the situation, right? So getting the contextual clues and understanding how does this need to be delivered. There are certain families. My family, I think growing up, as I look at it now, at least part of my family, very loud people, knock down, drag out, as they say, and then it's over, and everybody's back to normal. And my wife's family is quite subdued. And so when members of my family raise their voice because they're excited and loud, and like it really has a negative impact on her because she registers that as something totally different. And so how should it be said? I think, so if you can't answer those 4 questions, all right, so what needs to be said? Why does it need to be said? Who's the audience? And how should it be said? If you can't answer each of those 4 things, you probably aren't ready to communicate your message in question. And it should be noted that just because you have answers to those questions, that doesn't mean that you need to blurt out some message.
It really is sort of weaving into, as you're talking about that, like, how are you going to say it? What is your audience? They really have to have an understanding of your audience. And that sort of goes back to what we've talked about in a previous episode, is caring. You've got to know who they are. You've got to know, okay, this is a person, they do not want empty accolades. They want it straight.
Right.
They want to know exactly where they stand. They're very black and white. Like, hey, you messed up on this, you need to do better. And that's how they receive it. And that's how they really work. Whereas somebody will be like, listen, this is a really sensitive point for them. They're really respond poorly to negative feedback. This needs to be somebody who gets it communicated as encouragement, as I know you can do better. This is where I want you to achieve better. And that really goes back to understanding the people you're leading. A true mentorship, as you're talking about, like mentorship is such a closer relationship. It's amazing how much of communication goes back to caring and how it weaves into that.
Yeah. Yeah. As I'm sitting here, I realize I probably should have included, there's some questions that I developed in the writing of the book. There's some questions I developed to determine, hey, should I say this, right? Going back to that, does something need to be said? And so as I thought about that, like, how do I determine if something needs to be said? And so I kind of developed these 4 questions. The first was, if it is not said, what could be the negative effects? Because sometimes things need to be said, like, hey, don't put your hand on that hot stove, or some permutation to that end. So if it's not said, what could be the negative effects? That's the first question. The second question is, if it is said, what could be the negative effects? Right? It could demoralize your people. It could lead them to do something that they shouldn't be doing. It could have some negative consequences. So if it is said, what could be the negative effects? The third thing is, does the perceived need for it to be said outweigh the potential negative effects that you've just enumerated? Yeah, there's some negative effects that could occur, but it's still that important that I need to say. And then the final thing is, what is the goal in saying it? So what are you actually trying to accomplish in saying this? And so I think if you work through those and you get the answers to those, that can really help determine, hey, do I need to say this?
That's a great final point of what is the goal in saying it. Because if the goal is not always, I want to make the people on my team better, I want to get closer to our vision or our goal. If it's anything else, it seems like it probably doesn't need to be said. And I'm thinking about all this about communication and everything. I sort of come back with two examples. One would be the military, a group, a platoon with some objective. And if that objective is clearly delineated from the beginning and understood by its leaders, there really doesn't need to be any communication. Each sort of group pod can go off, and whatever circumstance, whatever difference they're into, they all understand the goal. It's why, lieutenants have their sergeants, and they all understand that because the plan and the goal has been communicated. Same thing on a football field where it gets down to 2 minutes. You don't have time to huddle up. But if they've already practiced over and over and over the 2-minute drill, we know what our team's strengths are. We know everyone on the field knows what they're going to do. And so whatever the defense does, whatever audibles they call, everyone is on the same page. Not because of any individual strengths of it, not that you got a great receiver and a great quarterback, but that the leader, the coach, the assistant coaches have clearly communicated the goal, and not only the goal, but the system in which they're going to function to get to that goal. Obviously, the goal for every team is a touchdown, but every team gets there a little differently. And the ones that really have an understanding of that, you can see it. And imagine you can see that in teams in whatever circumstance, just how clearly they function.
Right. Everybody's got it right in their own mind because it's been communicated, because the leader had it right in their own mind and communicated it clearly. So everybody's operating on the same game plan. 100% correct. Well, Justin, I think that's a great way to end out this podcast today. It's been really, really good getting to talk about this idea of getting things right in our own mind before we communicate, and then how do we go about trying to communicate those things? So thanks for a good conversation.